Law School, Professor Yorgos Delios, who will provide us with his greeting here at the chamber.
Dear participants, dear colleagues, it is a pleasure to be here today representing the Law School of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and an honor to open the workings of a conference co-organized by 3 universities, Bristol and Oslo universities, besides our own. The conference is devoted to one of the major issues today in both Europe and Greece: how to stimulate business, how to fuel the economy and keep up a development, not a jobless one, but how to open new jobs. After all, the theme is how to keep Europe vivid, economically powerful, politically democratic, and ecologically viable. There is a heated public debate going on about the crisis that our common European vision is going through. The vital role of business and entrepreneurship occupies significant space within that debate. It is therefore with great interest that I welcome you today to this conference entitled, very appropriately, Stimulating Business in a Europe in Crisis. In the following sessions, we will have the opportunity to enjoy speeches and comments delivered by distinguished speakers from a wide range of esteemed European universities. With their guidance, we will discuss the financial integration project of the European Union in the context of the economic adjustment program of Greece and the constitutional framework for the stimulation of European business and society. We will explore contemporary issues pertaining to corporations, states, and sustainability, as well as reflect on their impact by discussing audience, stakeholder, business, and policy engagement. Of course, there will also be a session that is devoted entirely to the case of Greece, an issue extremely relevant in light of the economic, social, and political developments of the last 7 years here in Greece that both reflect and influence the wider European Union setting. The conference's topic is also particularly important to those of us that reside here in Greece, both in our capacity as Greek citizens, but also in our capacity as Greek university professors that have to actively contribute to such public debates. This is why I feel that this venue was chosen wisely, and I look forward to today's extremely interesting presentations and plenary discussions, since I am sure that they will enrich our understanding of these delicate and complicated matters. Last but not least, I expect and hope that our non-Greek participants will enjoy our city, the food, and the people. Wishing you a fruitful and pleasant conference, I am now opening its proceedings. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that warm introduction to our conference and to Greece. Now we will have the honor of receiving a talk from Professor Takis Tridimas. So you'll bear with me for a few minutes while we connect with Skype with London.
Connection is fine from my end, yes.
Great. So please let me introduce Professor Takis Tridimas, who is a leading scholar in the field of European Union law. He is one of the most frequently quoted authors by Advocates General of the European Court of Justice and on matters of EU law by English courts. He's a professor at King's College London. And he will talk to us today on the eurozone crisis and governance, narratives of the rule of law.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to address you. I'd like to thank organizers for putting up this extremely interesting program. I would also like to thank you for bearing with me. It is unfortunate that I am not able to be present with you in beautiful Thessaloniki, and I have to do this via Skype. So thank you very much for bearing with me, having a remote connection. Now, I was going to address some issues pertaining to the eurozone crisis and the way it is changing the governance of Europe. So it is a journey, if you wish, on narratives of the rule of law. I have provided some PowerPoints, which may be available either now or perhaps later on. And really what I was going to do is this. First of all, discuss some alternative narratives of the crisis, then look at legal developments post-crisis, look at the salient features of recent policy responses, and then talk a bit about judges and the economy, because one of the effects of the crisis has been the judicialization of public finances. So what we have experienced over the last 5-6 years is really a quadruple crisis, if you wish, with 4 crises in one. We've had the global financial crisis of 2008, and this has been followed by a eurozone crisis, which really is a sovereign insolvency crisis, a sovereign liquidity crisis, and a banking crisis all at the same time. And usually these things go together, or at least they're very closely interconnected. Now, the reasons for the crisis I'm not going to go into. Suffice it to say that there has been a complex matrix of economic, legal, financial, political, and institutional causes. So how can we explain the whole thing? What are the alternative narratives of the crisis, if you wish? Okay, here are some of them. One is a moral narrative, if you wish. This is what I would call the fallen angels narrative. And it goes as follows, that just as individuals must manage their finances properly, so should states, so should sovereigns. And profligacy is not a virtue, it is a vice. And if you spend more than you can earn, then you should pay for it. It is, if you wish, a moral narrative that goes back to Protestant ethics. If you look at religious writings, Protestant religious writings of the 17th century, they refer to debt, and the devil. The 3 go together. So profligacy is a vice, needs to be punished. So in that sense, austerity is a process of catharsis. So that is one narrative, the moral narrative, as it were. There is a second narrative, which I would call the faulty genes narrative. And this really goes as follows. As soon as the euro was introduced, as soon as economic and monetary union entered its 3rd phase, there was an inherent instability in the genes of the eurozone project. And the inherent instability is the result of a weak economic policy, but strong monetary policy structures. The classic weak E, but strong M in the economic and monetary union. So given that we have centralization of interest rates, centralization of monetary policy decisions, but unaccompanied by a centralization of economic policy decisions, fiscal decisions. It was inevitable sooner or later that there would be a crisis of the sort that we experienced in 2010. There is a third crisis, a third narrative, if you wish, and this I would call the neoliberalism narrative. And this really is, if you wish, diametrically opposed to the moral narrative. According to the failure of neoliberalism narrative, what we are experiencing is the result of excessive pursuit of wealth on the part of private institutions, especially banks. This is what led to the 2008 global financial crisis and subsequently to the eurozone crisis. One could have an empire narrative. The fourth narrative is the empire narrative. And what I mean by this is that the whole crisis really has resulted in strengthening the powers of European institutions, powers of supranational structures. What we are experiencing, in effect, is an opportunity for the EU's appetite to increase its own powers to illustrate itself and be put into effect. So the whole regulatory framework that has followed the crisis can be seen as a strengthening of the European empire. Now, there is a final narrative which is a bit more modest. And this is a rule of law in transition narrative. And what I mean by this is this, that, well, we need to look at things at a historical perspective. When the Economic and Monetary Union was established, the only politically acceptable solution was to have a centralization of monetary policy powers, but leave economic policy to the member states. There was a structural imbalance, but what Europe is trying to do is respond to the crisis. And if one looks at the multiple measures that have been taken to do so, the international treaties, European Stability Mechanism, the plethora of measures that govern the eurozone, then this is a work in progress. We are doing better than if things were left to the nation states to manage. So this final narrative is a more modest one, one which acknowledges that there are imperfections, but in fact, what we have experienced in Europe over the last 5 years is the gradual building of a network of rules at supranational level that govern sovereign thought and which are much better than anything that has existed before. So the question, I suppose, is which narrative best explains a post-Eurozone developments, which narrative different constituencies embrace, which narrative perhaps the courts embrace. As lawyers, for us, I think courts are the pivotal institution. So one word then about the post-crisis legal architecture. What has changed? What's happened since the Eurozone crisis in terms of legislative trends and policy development? Now, I think even before the crisis of 2008, already from the beginning of the 2000s, financial law in the European Union has been the fastest growing area of law. The European Union, since the beginning of the 2000s, has embarked on a very ambitious program for the harmonization of banking legislation, capital markets legislation, and the realization, if you wish, of economic and monetary union. And this ambitious program has two aspects. One is directives or regulations that provide for substantive harmonization in certain areas, but also, and perhaps most importantly, a set of measures which introduce a new institutional architecture. I think in in, in all these areas, institution building is perhaps more important, or at least as important as substantive rules. So a great deal of legislation was passed within a very short period of time, and financial law has proved a fruitful ground for regulatory experimentation. New patterns of governance that were introduced in the financial law, capital markets law, were then extended to other areas. A prominent feature, I think there are two prominent features from all these developments. One is agency creation. We have experienced a tremendous growth in EU agencies, especially in the financial law field. We have the European Securities Market Agency, the European Banking Agency. We have an agency responsible for insurance and occupational pension schemes. We have new agencies coming into operation as a result of banking union. And these agencies have very extensive powers. They operate within legal confines, but they have very extensive powers. And I think this raises profound problems of accountability and democracy. What we are experiencing through all these matrix of agencies is the growth of a fourth branch of government outside the executive, outside the commission, and alongside the legislature and the judiciary, a fourth branch of government which is pretty headless. It doesn't have a head. This is really an expression, a headless fourth branch, first coined by American administrative lawyers to describe similar growth in federal agencies in the United States. So the first prominent aspect, I think, is agency creation. These agencies, a lot of them enjoy soft law power. So if one looks at a legislation, one cannot capture the true significance and the true extent of their powers. The second prominent aspect, I think, is that we are entering a post-internal markets era. And what do I mean by that? I mean the following. First, a pillar of the internal market, as it has developed from the 1990s onwards, has been the principle of mutual recognition. Banking institutions, financial institutions are subject to the control of the home country. It is the national authorities who are responsible for licensing, for authorization. Once a bank receives an authorization from a member state, then it can carry on business everywhere else in the EU. So a key aspect of the internal market has been the prominence of national authorities in monitoring enforcement legislation, in implementing EU law. Now, what we are now experiencing is, in fact, the direct intervention of the European Union or its agencies in regulating banks, in licensing banks and all other financial institutions. For example, credit rating agencies are not licensed by domestic authorities, they are licensed directly by the European Securities Market Authority. So, in the previous phase, if you wish, the European Union would concentrate on harmonizing substantive law, but the national authorities would do the enforcement, would do the monitoring, would be the front line, if you wish, institutions that deal with market participants. What we are now seeing is direct involvement of the European Union, not only in rule making, but also in the enforcement and the monitoring and the compliance process with the rule. So this departure from the mutual recognition, from the home control principle, so far is hesitant, but I think it is important development that changes the pattern of the internal market. Another aspect, equally important, is the fragmentation between eurozone and non-eurozone countries. One of the main challenges for the institution and indeed for the court, I think in the coming years, is how to ensure the integrity of the internal market in a constitutional setup where eurozone governance becomes more integrated, more intense, more federal, whilst the internal market and the acquis communautaire remains for all EU states. Now, apart from these two key trends, one can distinguish other ones. I'm aware of time. Let me just make reference to a couple of things which, again, I think appear to me to be very important in the macro level. An interesting aspect of the Eurozone legislation is the fusion between law reform and crisis management. I think the two exercises are different. A crisis management requires immediate intervention. It requires certain qualities of governance that the European Union does not necessarily have. To intervene in crisis situation, you need to have very clear authority. You need to have expertise. You need to have ample discretion. It requires executive discretion. And the European Union was not really built for that. There isn't much executive discretion. There is no clear competence for the EU institutions to intervene in crisis management situations. By contrast, law reform is a much more contemplative exercise. And there, I think the European Union has distinct advantages. It is more removed from electoral pressures than the national governments. It has unique expertise in that it can monitor, it can scan the development of national laws in several jurisdictions, and it can therefore search for long-term optimal law reform solutions. Now, what I think we experienced, in fact, it has been a fusion of these two exercises. The European Union has felt that it needs to do the firefighting, it needs to engage in crisis management, and it has done so sometimes perhaps by intervening too quickly, sometimes by intervening in a very heavy-handed way. But this fusion of crisis management and law reform, I think, has not helped dealing with the crisis. Final issue, the judicialization of public finances. I think that has been a novel development. Again, if you look what's happened over the last 5 years, you will find that there's been a number of court decisions, both at national level and at the European Union level, that deal with budgetary matters, public finance, competencies in the allocation of public money. This has traditionally been an area where courts have been absent, or at least they have been the forgotten partners. But this is no longer the case. Perhaps I can refer to 2 or 3 judgments of the European Court of Justice. Very quickly, the first judgment is the Pringle case, and the Pringle case is extremely important because it is the first case where the European Court has to distinguish between economic policy, monetary policy. It is a competence case. Who can do what? And it is a remarkable judgment because for the first time, I think, in the development of case law, the European Court of Justice takes a narrow view of EU competence, a narrow view of monetary policy, and a correspondingly broader view of economic policy, which within member states. So it is a case where the court takes a narrow view of EU competence, but it does so in order to facilitate integration, in order to rescue the European Stability Mechanism Treaty. It is what the court is doing in Pring effectively is engaging in constitutional containment. It tries to contain the damage to the integrity of EU law. A second case, which has to do with agency creation, relates to the powers of the European Securities Markets Agency. And I think what the court is doing there is broadening the powers of EU agencies. And finally, there is a cluster of judgments decided by the General Court that deal with the nature of the Eurogroup. And the General Court takes the view there that the Eurogroup is not a body that takes legally binding decisions. It is a talking shop, and therefore it is not possible to challenge decisions. In my view, with the greatest respect, I think this does not reflect a political and economic reality. It is a cluster of judgments that relate to a parallel universe. But one can talk about them for hours. To conclude, to summarize, first, I don't think that there is a grand plan of European integration. The way the European Union evolves is the result of responses to unpredicted developments. It is the result of the vicissitudes of the political process. I think it is incorrect to think that there is a grand plan of European integration, or even a plan to which the majority of the member states, in fact, concurs, except in very abstract terms. Secondly, I think there is a shift in the integration paradigm, and I think this is the result of the post-internal market era, the result of agency creation, the result of more powers being transferred to the European Union, and the result of differentiated integration. What we are experiencing is the growing importance of enhanced cooperation in the European Union. A final trend, the judicialization of public finances. As I said earlier, the European Court of Justice inevitably is drawn into some very powers of governments to manage budgets. And I think from the point of view of an Anglo-Saxon court, it would be unthinkable to get into this kind of decision. Of course, the German Federal Constitutional Court has also been active in this area. Thank you very much for listening.
Everyone can hear me now. And thank you very much for providing us with such a thorough discussion of all the matters that need to be addressed. And I think there's much relevance to the case of Greece, which is something we want to delve into today and discuss in more detail. So thank you very much. And we look forward to welcoming you in person at our next conference. But thank you very much for being able to provide us.
Thank you. I'm very happy to take questions if that is. I'm not sure what the format is and whether this is technically possible.
I could open the floor if anyone wants to. I could open the floor to anyone who'd like to give a question, provide a question. Perhaps a small question that I would have is, what I really like the point you made about the European supervisory authorities and the powers that they're slowly and without actually without us being aware of how many powers subtly they're being given. And I think there's a big distinction between what is constitutionally permissible and what is practically desirable. And I was wondering what your kind of standpoint on this is. How do you think that will evolve? Will it lean towards what is constitutionally allowed, or will we start seeing a movement to what is practically necessary for the rulemaking to be more efficient and correspond better to what is necessary?
Thanks. I think you're absolutely correct. I think there is a gap between, as you said, what is desirable and functional and necessary practice and what can be done. I think a lot depends on the behavior of institutional actors, how the various branches of government, if you wish, understand those powers. So a lot depends on how the agencies themselves exercise these powers, how far the Commission or the European Parliament are prepared to monitor their exercise. So far, it does not appear to me that the European Parliament or the Commission are prepared to have a close look at the powers of agencies. And it seems to me that this is where the key lies, in proper accountability and control mechanisms which operate in practice. It also depends on how far the court will rein in the agencies. Now, I think courts tend to be very pragmatic. You can take the view that what is rational is also compatible with the Constitution. What is not rational is not compatible with the Constitution, is a very pragmatic view. And I think this is really where the European Court of Justice is heading if we look at the existing case law on agency power. But it is a work in progress. It is an evolving area. And I think one would need to see how these agencies will have exercised their powers once we have a significant period of experience. They've only really existed for the last 3-4 years.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting comment. So I suppose that with the EU generally, we have to see step by step how things progress rather than formulating an opinion beforehand. So it is an evolving case. And because we are short for time, unfortunately, I think we'll close this session with this comment on the agencies. and the court's position, which we await to see on different matters. We thank you very much once again, and we hope that you will be able to see our proceedings online, so you can get a better idea of the conference and what we've discussed today.
Thank you.
Once
Thank you
it's
very
complete.
much. Thank you again for allowing me to take part remotely.
Thank you very much. So greetings from Greece. Goodbye.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone. I think because I was in haste before, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Georgina Tsagas. I'm a lecturer at the University in Bristol. And I'd like to introduce also my co-organizers, Professor Charlotte Villiers from the University of Bristol, which is co-organizing from our institution, Professor Beate Sojofel, if I pronounced it correctly, from the University of Oslo, and Professor Lina Papadopoulou from the Law School of the Aristotle University. It's been a pleasure co-organizing with you, and we all welcome you to today's conference. Just some points. Thank you for that. Just some points on the program. There have been some slight changes. I'd like to make a point on the fact that one of our presenters, Professor Rizvas, won't be joining us today, but instead we will have a change in the program, and we have Professor Tineke Lamboy presenting on a case study in the third session today on sustainability, corporations and the state. And Dr. Thomas Papadopoulos, who's presenting, will have his presentation in the second session on the case of Greece. So that's one change we need to refer to. And also one correction, Roseanne, who is presenting with Charlotte, also in the third session, is a lecturer at Cardiff University and a PhD candidate at Bristol. So apologies for the mistake. And now I'd like to move on to the third session, and our chair is Professor Charlotte Villiers. So if I could pass on the floor to you.
Okay, it's with great pleasure that this session we will be exploring the EU financial integration project in context. And to starters, we have Beate Sojofel, who will be talking about coherence or conflict, the constitutional framework for the stimulation of European business and society.
Okay, okay, now it's definitely on. Thank you for that. I'm very happy to be here and to honor this beautiful country which we're in. I'm going to attempt a few sentences in Greek before I start on my actual presentation. Είμαι πολύ χαρούμενη που βρίσκομαι εδώ στη Θεσσαλονίκη. It seems very loud. Is it too loud? No? It just seems like that for me. Okay. Probably because I'm speaking in Greek. Με μεγάλη χαρά διοργανώσαμε το συνέδριο αυτό μαζί με τους συναδέλφους μου από το Μπρίστολ και την καθηγήτρια Λίνα Παπαδοπούλου. Ευχαριστώ πολύ, Λίνα. Η Ελλάδα είναι πάντα στην καρδιά μου. Η Ελλάδα ως παράδειγμα είναι πολύ σημαντική στην συζήτηση μας για την Ευρώπη. Μερικά από τα προβλήματα που αντιμετωπίζει η Ελλάδα είναι συμπτώματα μεγαλύτερων ευρωπαϊκών και παγκόσμιων ζητημάτων. Η συζήτηση αυτών των θεμάτων επομένως δεν αφορά την Ελλάδα, αλλά την Ευρώπη και τον κόσμο όλο. For non-Greek speakers, I try to express both my love for Greece and the fact that some of the problems that we are discussing today are symptoms of larger systemic issues relevant for Europe and indeed for the whole world. And for the Greek speakers, excuse my pronunciation, I am learning, still early learner. So what I will be speaking about is not the Greek crisis, not the economic crisis, not the austerity measures. I will be trying to speak instead about the larger objectives, because to paraphrase Aristotle, will it not make our aim straighter and our values clearer if we know what we are aiming at? And indeed, it is very relevant to ask what the objectives are of the European project, because EU legal method in itself is teleological, it is objective-oriented, and it is dynamic, so it is meant to change with time and meant to be able to cope with whatever societal issues that are paramount at the moment. And even if you ask EU legal scholars, you will get quite different answers about what the objectives of the European project are. Some might say that it's an integrated internal market, or that it's free movement, or, especially after financial crises, that it's economic growth, it's getting back to business as usual. Or if we look at the policy documents of the EU, it says that our goal is smart, inclusive, and sustainable growth. And of course, with the topical Greek issue, financial stability is also mentioned as an objective. But is that actually the objective of the European project? Is that what the EU is about? Well, if we look at the treaties, we will see that after the Lisbon reform, Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union says that the values of the EU are respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. Included amongst the values are not economic growth. Article 3.1 of the Treaty of the European Union says that the aim of the EU is to promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its peoples. Peace is now mentioned explicitly in the treaties, but it has been clear right from the beginning of this great European project after the Second World War that the overarching aim was the good of the European people. It was to achieve peace. The idea was that people who have trade with each other, integrated trade, integrated market, they won't go to war with each other again. And if we then look at it more on a more operational level, we see that sustainable development, achieving a balance of environmental and social issues and economic issues, is in many ways the overarching objective of Europe, and also an important global issue and a global aim. And sustainable development has an important place in EU law, in EU treaty law. I'm not yet talking so much about what happens in practice, I'm talking about what the treaties as our joint constitution tells us. And we see that this has been strengthened through the Treaty of Lisbon, because it now says explicitly that the Union shall work for the sustainable development of Europe. And it also exceptionally for the first time now mentions that the Union shall also contribute to the sustainable development of the earth. But of course sustainable development is a difficult concept to deal with. What is sustainable development? What does it mean if we balance everything? Does it mean that we prioritize nothing? But indeed, if we take sustainable development seriously, then it is balancing with an aim, which as Aristotle pointed out long before the EU was ever thought about, gives direction to our work. And I will make the case that there is a special position for the environmental dimension. And indeed we have in the treaties, we have had for decades, and it's even clearer now after the Lisbon Treaty, the environmental integration rule. This is the core of the sustainable development principle, which is also a general principle of international law. Because the core is integration, and we're then not speaking about market integration, but in integrating environmental protection requirements into the duties, and as a duty into all policies and activities of the EU. This is a duty with legal significance for the EU institution and indirectly also for member states. But why? Who cares? Who cares about sustainable development and the environment when people are losing their jobs and even within Europe, within Greece, people are actually in danger of starving, or they don't know where to sleep, they don't know how to feed their children. Who cares about such a vague objective as sustainable development? Well, science shows us that we actually do have to care about this if we care about our children and their future, because we live on one planet with certain planetary boundaries that the seminal article of Rockström and his colleagues have operationalized through drawing up 9 planetary boundaries, and we have already transgressed 4 of them. That means in the long run, if we carry on with business as usual, that we will make our planet uninhabitable. And as Kate Raworth has pointed out, sustainable development is of course not just about respecting the planetary boundaries and finding a safe operating space for humanity, but finding a safe and just operating space for humanity. Because her point is, if we go to the planetary boundaries, if we are right in the middle, keep as far away from all boundaries as we can, we use no resources, then we are okay in terms of the planetary boundaries, but we're all dead. Because if we use no resources, then that's death. So therefore, she has framed this as living within the donut, because we need to use enough resources to be able to create good living conditions for all the people in the world and still stay within the planetary boundaries. So therefore the donut. It's an image that works for me at least. So we have these great overarching objectives of the EU. And then we have practice. And in practice, there's a reason why many people mention economic growth or free movement or market integration or financial stability as the objectives, because that's where the focus often is. So in practice, we have conflict. We have a conflict between the overarching objectives and what we see in practice. And I will argue that not only is it wrong as a matter of law and as a matter of values to ignore the overarching objectives, but it's not good for the economy either. Because if we destroy the very basis of our existence, the economy will fail as well. It seems banal to have to say this, but listening to many policymakers speaking about economic growth as if it were the aim of humanity, it actually is necessary to say this. So we need to be able to find out how to stabilize a system that can sustain us all, but that has to be within the planetary boundaries. And in the long run, it's a huge systemic risk by trying to save the economy of any part of Europe or any part of the world by just printing money and expecting things to work if we just get back on the track of business as usual. Business as usual is a very certain path towards a very uncertain future. I know it may seem like a good place to go when things are going wrong, but we need instead to use this crisis as an opportunity to reframe the way that we are doing things, to use it as a way of stimulating, which is the topic for this conference, of stimulating the innovative, creative potential that businesses and we all as human beings have to find sustainable ways of maintaining our societies and our way of life. And as legal scholars, it is our duty to point out when the direction that the policymakers are taking are in violation of the objectives of the treaty, are in violation of the environmental integration rule, and indeed are in violation of our aim of having a safe and just space for humanity. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to great discussions today. Σας ευχαριστώ.
Professor Lina Papadopoulou will now offer a comment on Beate's words.
Well, good morning from my side as well. Thank you very much. Well, it is rather difficult to comment on Professor Zjofjel's paper. Did I pronounce it correctly? Thank you. Delia, thank you very much. Because she pointed out to a very important issue, to the dilemma, I would say, between, sometimes it is a dilemma, between sustainable and development. I mean, whether having businesses in a certain way could underestimate the environment. And to that extent, I would follow her conclusion, where she says that sometimes there is a conflict. So what I would like to add on those very, to the point, I would say, remarks, would actually be the dimension of public participation when it comes to decisions. Exactly because decisions, according to my opinion, should not be taken far from the citizens, far from the subjects who are concerned, either through losing their jobs, as already been mentioned, or citizens who would lose maybe their quality of life if the environment is undermined. So I would rather focus on the public participation in European environmental law. If one looks at the EU law, in the primary law, there is no use of the terms of public participation or consultation when it comes to environmental matters, but this situation is different when it comes to secondary law. And there, the European Union law has ratified and incorporated two very important conventions, international conventions, the ESPO Convention and the Aarhus Convention. The first one, the ESPO, has to do with environmental impact assessment in a transboundary context, and it is a legal instrument in a transnational and multilateral environmental, whereas the Aarhus Convention was drafted in 1998, in Aarhus, obviously, by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and it has to do with public participation in decision-making and access to justice in environmental matters. The purpose of the Aarhus Convention was actually that the public should be allowed to actively participate in such kind of decisions like the ones that Professor Zjofjel referred to, where there is maybe a dilemma concerning the Greek standards. I could possibly think, for example, on Skouries, the gold mine in Chalkidiki, where really the decision is very hard to be taken. And the convention concerns also administrative decisions, that is when the state has to give or to refuse for a business to be set up when it may be dangerous for the environment. Of course, the main object here, the main concern is to protect future generations so that they also, or maybe better if it's possible, live in a healthy environment and an environment which is also adequate for welfare. So how could one actually reconcile both objectives? The convention is based on 3 pillars. The first one is information, the second is public participation, and the third one is access to justice. And public participation does not only refer to environmental impact assessment of businesses, but also to public participation in general in environmental procedures. Coming back to EU law, as I said before, the EU law has incorporated these international conventions, and it's, as a matter of fact, the Aarhus Convention gave a strong impetus to the development of European law, and especially when it comes to the understanding of the public participation. This is very evident in a number of directives. You may have the numbers here, but I will only focus to some of them, which I think they are the most important ones. The first one, where there was no public participation in 85, but only information and consultation process between the authorities and the public concerned. The term public concerned is a terminus technicus, so it means something, but it is also very important how to define the public concerned, because as you may imagine, as wide as the public concerned is understood, the wider the spectrum and the more the citizens that are being involved in the participation or at least consultation process. Then we have the directive of 2003, where the Aarhus Convention became part of the European law. And it is very interesting and very useful to underline that here we want more accountability and transparency, and of course environmental awareness from the side of the public. So people, the citizens, the public concerned, which sometimes is almost everybody, should be first of all environmentally aware of possible spillover effect of specific projects and plans and businesses in their area. And it's